Let's start with our Q&A. We've got this map back up because one of the questions that's come in online is related to this question. So Charles is going to field this one.
Do you want to start?
Oh, you've got the question.
I got the question.
Sure.
Is that the one that you sent to me?
Of course, yeah.
Yes, I'd like to read the question. So the question is about the map. Thank you very much for the presentation. That's great. I see lots of household level data points in the interactive map. How many data points do we have? Basically asking what actually the map shows and what percentage of the population these represent. The second question, and the third question is basically how do we categorize the colors? Can we walk the 6 categories, etc. So the answer to the first question, can you zoom in, Graham? If you zoom in, what you will see that the map shows each household in Manchester and Salford. So if you zoom in even further, just wait for a second, wait. Okay, so these are the household shapes. So the map basically shows each household, and if you click on each household, it will give you an individual score. Usually it's quite a granular and detailed approach, but you see the people doing 20-minute neighborhoods. They look at where the services are and say these are where the services, and they look at how many households can access to services or the cluster of services. We took a different approach, slightly detailed. So rather than looking at where the services are, we look at where the households are. How many of these services these households can access to. So it's more residential led. So these are the residential units in dwellings in Manchester and Salford. That includes semi-detached houses as well as flats. So it's not just houses, but also flats too. It also includes like blocks where you have stores at the bottom and households on the top, like they're kind of mixed-use flats. That also included in the map too. So this represents about 99% of the population who lives in Manchester and Salford. Obviously, people who are homeless and who do not have no fix about, that's not included in the map because they don't have a house. So what we looked at as the new households. And the next step, as I said earlier, and in terms of the scoring, we had a bit of a discussion whether do we put ratings to individual services and amenities, like green space is rated quite highly, so we put more weight. But because we have lots of categories, if you do any sort of research in that area, you will know that after a certain point, weightings do not actually matter because you have so many categories, they become meaningless when you actually aggregate all the results. So what we end up doing something a bit simpler is, if you look at the article we published or the slide, it shows how we did the coding and the weighting. Is if you meet certain criteria, for example, if you have access to GP surgery and a pharmacy, you get a score of 1 for health. If you have access to a green space or over 2 hectare size or some sort of open space and a playground, blah, 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 you get score 1 on the green space. If you have access to post office, then you get score 1. If you have access to a cash machine and I can't remember exactly top of my head, something else, you get score 1. So there's like this if-else conditions that we applied. And basically we give scores 0 if you don't have an access or score 1 if you meet the criteria. And at the end, we just tally the score and then give a overall score. 6 is the maximum because we have 6 teams: health, food, retail, green, transport, and something else I can't remember now. And 0 is the minimum. And that was the 3 questions from the questions. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay. So have we got any questions from people in the room?
Just regarding that map again, it seems like a tool that would be really, really useful for anyone who's working in this area. Can you create these maps for the cities? How labour intensive is it, or how much specialism do you need to be able to do this kind of stuff?
Yeah. So very good question. I'm actually trying to automate this. through actually using AI, ChatGPT, but I'm not a computer scientist, so I still fail at doing that, but that's a long-term goal. This map that I showed you, I had a researcher which spent about 50 hours crunching the data, cleaning the data and preparing the data for me. And then I spent probably maybe around another 50 hours preparing the data for the researcher and producing the map. So all in all, it's 100 hours. And then I had, I think it was £1,000 we had for the researcher. My time was paid by the university. So about 100 hours that it took to do Manchester and Salford. If you were to do it for the whole Greater Manchester, I reckon 25 hours per district. And that's about 250,000 households, I think. And maybe another 10 hours for someone to actually produce the map. But once you have all the data, producing the map is actually quite easy because you're just aggregating all the results and just playing with a few bits and then it's there. The real challenge was to actually preparing the data for be able to use. Which is about, again, 25 hours per district. District, I'm like in your local authority.
Yes. Thanks for some really interesting presentations. I was wondering, this is a question for all of you really, how much you think opposition to cities 20-minute neighbourhoods is shaped by the quite unique circumstances following the pandemic, and therefore the extent to which we should expect this to be a long-term or a short-term set of opposition, and shaped very anecdotally in my own case by an experience of bumping into a protest in Sheffield where a lady with a megaphone was drawing a very direct link between vaccines, masks, clean air zones, low traffic neighbourhoods and the inevitable rise of communism in Sheffield.
What's it in particular? Maybe off Patrick there.
I suppose the fact that let's say the government did take quite unique powers in terms of controlling people's movement during the height of the COVID. So maybe that had some impact, but actually I think it's more of a kind of fundamental cultural, well, a cultural difference or a priority difference between groups. And I mean, we've got 50 years, almost perhaps 100 years now, of the car being catering for the car, that the car is the way you travel. You know, you can still look, it is still the absolute assumption that in terms of travel that you're thinking about car, and lots of things from adverts and how people talk. So we're trying to impact a very big cultural change in travel behaviour, and I think that will inevitably, there will be people resistant, because in a way, if you can take their perspective, you are taking away rights. That right about drive freely where you want to is a right that they've had for many years. And so it's a question of balancing rights, but I think it will inevitably be a bumpy ride, and it is a case where it depends upon political leadership, I think, in a way. But I think looking at the results of those elections, I think show it is still the majority, and quite less, perhaps the silent majority, is in favour of these changes. It's let's say it's a brave politician who's willing to kind of take on this, and maybe Oxford is also different in many ways, because different research we looked at showed that people who cycled and walked were much more in favour of LTNs than people who drove. Not it kind of, the ones who drove were actually split, so it was kind of like a 50-50, but you definitely got walkers and cyclists generally were in favour, and Oxford obviously has more cyclists than most places. So that's my answer.
Does anybody else want to come in before we move on to another question, or anything else in the chat? Graham, no.
Yes, but we can bring them in
Okay.
when we're ready.
Just as a segue to that, do you think there are outside influences driving that discussion in Oxford? You know,
Yes, I mean, yes, definitely, absolutely.
what would they be?
Well, I mean, it's on various people. I'm not really up to different names, but who are kind of well known, let's say, for being anti-LTN, anti-restrictions on car, who were at that demonstration, I'll call it. I also kind of noted, because there have been previous demonstrations against the LTNs, and there were different, but certainly there were different people at some of these demonstrations. So I think it had to a certain extent been taken over by people outside Oxford, but equally, I mean, there were still Oxford people, and there are Oxford people who feel, let's say, very much affected by this, and I suppose feel the need to kind of, well, to make their views known, which is part of democracy. They have that right.
Yeah, this is just following on from the same discussion, really. In terms of resource, at Wigan, we're trying to get through an active neighbourhood, and we're really struggling. A lot of our officers are just wasting time answering emails on a one-by-one basis. So in terms of, I don't know, sort of bean counter, how are you spending your day? Have you got any advice on how to deal with these really challenging consultations that can suck up so much resource?
Well, first of all, you need the resources. We have been inundated with lots of complaints, FOIs, EIRs, all those which are kind of time consuming. If I were to give advice, we created standard lines, standard responses on all the issues. So but one of the, I think the important things is to kind of know the data, the research data that goes behind this, and so you know, and also to actually do surveys. I mean, surveys can always be argued against. We say, well, it's not representative and things like that. But at least if you've got local data, you can say, oh, maybe it won't necessarily be in your favour, but I think if you do it in a honest way, it possibly will. But that's kind of, at least you've got that. It has required a lot of resources. It is, I think, inevitable. I've been in this game for a very long time, and I look back at kind of anything which is quite kind of affecting quite a impactful change on travel behaviour, particularly on, is going to require a lot of effort and a lot of resources and a lot of political will. I mean, the High Street, the one back in 1999, I'm sure, which I was there, but I could go back even further to the closure of Corn Market. So there's all these changes are difficult to implement, but I think once they're in, I don't know what period of time, but they become normal up to a certain point. But it takes a long time, I think, or it takes several years. But we don't know that yet. It's certainly not normal yet. It is still contested, you'd say, in a political way. In fact, very physically, by people actually still attacking we put in very strong bollards, very but the people going out with basic hacksaws, sawing these through. So we're still. It's still, let's say, it's still in contention. I mean, but they have been politically. They are now the Cowley ones have been. It's a TRO. It's no longer an ETRO. Whereas the East Ox ones is still an ETRO, which will go to council later this year.
You need time and resources, basically. Yes.
I'm just curious if this says the LTNs have occurred in certain areas, and if people prior to having that occur were so against it. Obviously, I'm not from here. So I don't know. And then after the LTNs were put into place and the quality of life maybe shifted or changed, what the response was then in the community, and if that's been looked at.
You talked about, didn't you, a little bit in yours, that shift in attitude?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a mix, I think, in terms of post consultations. And I've looked at some data in London where some people post intervention wanted to keep it, and some places didn't.
Time though, I mean, like, that's the change like you're referring to is like it takes time for people to adjust to change and to kind of get over that anger.
Yeah, and I think one of the parallels I kind of draw on some of the work I've done is in all the sort of NIMBY literature as well. The kind of classic study about wind farms that I kind of always point at where, you know, pre-installation of these wind farms, there was lots of concern about dappling and what it's going to do, and is it going to set off epilepsy and things like that. And then they went back a year later and said, so what do you think about the wind farm? Well, that's fine. And there's a lot of that goes on as well, where people, I think people have right to change sometimes as well, and probably buy into some of that sort of fear mongering. Sometimes it's going to be a disaster and ambulances won't get to your house and you won't be able to get out and you'll be trapped in your neighbourhood, and then you live with it for a year and it's quite so whatever anything. That's okay. And then I would suspect that in some of those places with an established low traffic neighbourhood, if they came in and said, so we'll take those bollards out now, you would have the same people.
I don't really know, but
I'm just going to say, we did do a cohort survey with the first Cowley LTNs. It wasn't a particularly big cohort survey, but it did imply a small shift. People in favour of the LTNs post implementation. But I mean, I wouldn't. Yeah, it was not a huge survey, even though it was a kind of cohort survey. But at least it was meant to be representative of groups.
Just plug in very quickly. People Active Travel Academy in University of Westminster, they did published longitudinal studies.
A lot as well, actually.
Yeah.
A lot of evidence.
And they, so Rachel Eldred is leading the team and wonderful team of people who are doing lots of research on LTNs.
A lot of that evidence really nicely skewers a lot of the attack lines as well. It's like, the emergency service responses are not affected by it. Boundary road NOx data is not affected by it. It's, crime goes down. All of the kind of things that are kind of wheeled out as being reasons why low traffic neighbourhoods are bad things are just not borne out by the evidence.
that's science.
It's dangerous with facts.
Yeah. We kind of use HR as evidence quite a lot, but then we do get countered. Well, that's London. That's not Oxford. I've been essentially a valid rebuttal. So we try and gather information ourselves in terms of the monitoring team. Could I help you do that?
I think Graham's got a follow-up to this.
Yeah, thanks. There's a point of clarification, I think, for Patrick. This is from Ian. I don't have the full names, I'm afraid, but the point of clarification and a bigger question. So the clarification is, you mentioned the local election in 2022. Did you say that 30% of votes went to anti-LTN candidates?
In the wards where anti-LTN candidates stood, yes.
I think that might be the clarification I wanted. Thanks. Another person asks, is anonymous. Patrick alluded to the lack of levers that local government has about the location of services. How can this be addressed? And then they ask, which is the bigger question, I guess, is there a risk that the 2020 concept will devolve into a cars versus active travel issue whilst missing the bigger opportunities around tackling climate change?
What was the first part?
So that's about the lack of levers that local government has about the location of services, whether that's an issue, how much that is an issue, and how we address it.
I work for the county council rather than the city or district council, so I'm not a huge expert on planning, but I do get the impression. Well, I deal with quite a lot of planning, but in spite of that, and it is always a challenge to, I mean, for many reasons, to really, well, to position, position the services within, let's say, new developments. I mean, but I kind of, that's just my spirit. I can't, someone might come back as a planner and say we've got more controls, but from my experience, we don't have many controls in terms of doing that. I can't, the second question was about.
Here is a bigger question around whether we end up with a debate around cars versus active travel when there's a bigger issue, which is climate change.
Well, in a way, that's why that is one of the main reasons that we are implementing all these schemes. I mean, there are many other reasons, but one of the main reasons is the council's committed to tackling climate change and has targets. We've got very ambitious targets of kind of reducing car trips by 2030 by 1/3. And if realistically, the place we're going to achieve that will be in cities and in the large urban areas rather than on the journeys to and from the urban areas. So the council, the cabinet is committed to that, and that's through. I suppose we've got evidence already that inside those LTNs that behaviour is beginning to change. More children are cycling. There are more people walking, more people are cycling, and there's a lot fewer car journeys within the LTN areas. In terms of the boundary roads, there's been a slight increase on the ones, but it is kind of 1%, 2% increase. So I think in the bigger picture of tackling carbon, that's the reason we're doing it. I mean, we don't want to create a kind of a car versus. I think in a way we're looking at in sense. I think we don't accept that that's people who have car driving as part of their either concept or part of their life. Their delivery people or like that. We're missing. We're not actually accepting that we are putting quite a burden on them. We kind of often apologize, saying we understand that this will be a transition. It will be difficult for many people, but there's a greater benefit at the end. And this is a kind of difficult period. It doesn't necessarily always kind of hit home saying that, but we try and be open in sense of what we're doing and why we're doing it. I think it's in the end kind of it's not exactly apologize, but you have to say yes. There are some things. There was a balance of priorities. Children going to school will be, I think, our great prize, because those LTNs have a lot of schools with them, including quite a big school, and that will be the kind of real parents start letting their children cycle on these basically fairly traffic-free routes, and because I think using car as a school run is one of our big impacts on our traffic congestion, which is another big reason, and also the huge developments now happening in Oxford, which means we can't. Business as usual is no longer possible. Can't go on. It's got to change, or else we'll be. Well, we've got endemic congestion, but even more endemic congestion. That's what it's.
Yeah, it's one of the most visible signs of climate change, isn't it? It's one of the things you can tackle as a council, isn't it? Our dependency. So inevitably people are going to see that, they're going to be discussing it. I think there's a question about discourse of language, wasn't there, as well?
Yes.
Can we come back to that in a bit?
If you like, yeah.
There's a couple of questions at the back, so they might be relevant. Yes, sir.
Just wanted to ask Alex a question, but I think it fits with this general theme. Alex, at the end, and I wanted you to reflect and expand on this, you contrasted the number of households with the number of vehicles going down the road. And I think it really fits into this framing thing. What are we trying to achieve here, and how are we going to achieve it? And in Toxteth, in that kind of area, I imagine most of the people who live in those houses don't own those houses. So we have a very mobile population. And it also alludes to some research that we did in South Yorkshire, which showed that 20% of people drove somebody else in their household 5 or more days a week, so that we get this overinflated idea that drivers are the predominant importance here, when in fact what we're trying to achieve is something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think one thing I always try and point out to people as well is that if you actually look at the modal share, yes, so looking at Liverpool, the car is the most dominant modal split in sort of like 4/5 of the wards, but it's only the majority in about 3 of the wards. Car drivers are not, but in terms of the whole population, they are not a majority of people. More people move by other means around the city. But I think it's a real philosophical question about who the city is for, and are there places in the city where we accept that there will be more movement. I'm always interested in the idea of Ghent, where they got the ring road, and you go to the ring road, and that's for driving, and we know that. And then it comes to the issue. One of the critiques of 50-minute cities and low traffic neighbourhoods is, what about the people who live there, who inevitably tend to be poorer? But I think we need to kind of reckon with some of those bigger philosophical debates about who's using the city and who has the rights of the streets, and are the streets which are good, and we sort of seem to have crept in now through Google Maps and Waze and all those sorts of sat nav things that the side roads are just kind of quicker routes to nip through rather than sitting in traffic. And I think it's what you were saying before, Patrick, as well. One thing I like is the kind of Danish philosophy that no one's saying that you can't drive. That's fine. But what we're saying is that's for you, that bit of infrastructure is for you, and there's a bit of infrastructure here for bikes. And more recently, I'm kind of struck by things like the smoking ban in pubs and restaurants. You know, we now take that as a given that that's okay, but 20 years ago it was perfectly fine to spark one up while you're having your dinner. And now it's no one's saying you can't smoke. That's not banned. We're just saying you can't smoke here. And that seems to me that we're trying to do a similar thing with cars. No one's saying you can't drive your car to the shops if you want to. If that's a fundamental part of your mobility, that's still part of the modal mix. What seems to be what we're saying is that you can't drive, or you should drive less in certain contexts and through certain routes. And it requires it's a big philosophical shift. And I think it probably, picking up on what Patrick says, there's a bit of carrot and a bit of stick that's needed there for various groups and various people to make that work.
There is that misconception, though, isn't it, that I just think you try and make them make all their car journeys by active travel all the time. And so, yeah, as Patrick's data shows, most people actually support active travel modes.
Yeah.
So, like, your question about people that live in these areas probably don't own the cars. So there's this silent majority that are actually supportive of these schemes, but it's that vocal minority that are making the problems for guys like the guys at Wigan and their schemes that are trying to push through. Yes.
Question.
Sorry, go on.
Which one?
I'll take this chance to move the glasses.
So it seems to me that unlike wind farm example we gave Alex, we've got tons of low traffic neighbourhoods. They've been pulled back. So somebody did some work in Bath and they counted them up. I think it was about 40, and only about 5 or 6 of them were new ones. So there's a massive load of examples. These places that work, that are healthy, where people can find jobs, etc., etc. So is the problem the branding, LTN, 15-minute city? So LTN is kind of excluding drivers, isn't it, by the name of it, low traffic, if you assume traffic that many cars and most vehicles. Pedestrians and traffic. Is there a real big problem with the new term that's got 10 years of shouldn't we just be saying, let's get back to those basic ideas, livable streets?
I do wonder now that have 15-minute cities and 20-minute cities become toxic because of all of that sort of conspiracy type protest stuff, where you've got people that, we're all here because we're interested in this, but most people aren't, and the only thing they've heard about is a protest, that have seen something in the paper or something like that, and they go, well, I've heard about those 15-minute cities, aren't they communism? And then all of a sudden, if you hear that that's going to come to your street, you just think it's bad, and you've already got to overcome that negative image. And I just wonder if the planning concepts aren't new. Walkability, whatever you called it before, I remember learning at university when I was 18. The ideas haven't gone away, but whether it just needs either a rebrand or just as it might be that going back to just the basic principles, because I suspect as you said in your thing, Patrick, if you ask people, would you like to live within 15 minutes of a shop and a school, so on and so on.
I mean, I think asking every public intellectual that spouts about low traffic neighbourhoods whether they live in a road that's got through traffic on it would be a good start. Shut them up.
A quick comment. You can jump in as well, Florence. That one of the things that we did in our paper, that we also drove similarities between sustainability and 15-20-minute neighborhoods. And one of the ideas behind sustainability and using a very broad definition for sustainability was creating this ambiguous, what was it called?
Sense of ambiguity.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah, insofar as it's quite useful in that everyone can rally around a concept that means many things, but at the same time, how do you put that into practice when it means many different things to many different people? And you know, globally, acts have been signed into law and so forth around this concept, but then enacting them into actual action has become much more difficult. And I think I was also just going to say, we were almost looping back there to service accessibility, which I think is equally as important a concept within the 20-minute neighbourhood as low traffic and active travel. And the question that was online about whether it's reduced to cars versus active travel debate, because this is as much about, for example, we've been looking at the neighbourhood level, sort of neighbourhood plan perspective, but they include looking at towns and rural areas as well as cities. And it's just as much about, is that village shop still there? Is that neighbourhood shop still there that you can walk to and get what you need? Or indeed the bus stop or park or whatever it is. Because if it's not, obviously that's connected to the transport debate, because if it's not within walking distance, you're going to drive to one that is. But we need to remember both sides of the debate. It's not just about, is there a bike lane to your service? It's about whether your service is still there. And if not, can we design one in or design one into a new neighbourhood so that we're creating infinite neighbourhoods, which then links back to climate change.
Yeah, so some of the work we're doing in Leo's loads of questions now is around that issue of you can create mobility or you can enable mobility, but if the facilities and the shops and the culture and these elements you've identified aren't there, and people don't get out and make those journeys. So you know, we're kind of looking at yes, sir. Life.
On that and the data set kind of area. What is the quality of data? And here I'm thinking about the access to things. So like things like the cash machine data, does it charge or is it free to use? Can it differentiate that? Because I've got one near me, but I wouldn't use it because it charges a lot. But also, does it include severance? I'm thinking here about underpasses that no one would use after 4 o'clock at night when it's dark. So you might have an underpass to the shops or your service, but it's ruled out most of the day because people and it's a busy road. So what's the ability of that data set to go that little bit further? There might be a service, but it's probably not going to be used by a lot of people.
Yeah, a very good question. So I use 2 data sets mainly. The first one for the services, I use ordnance survey data. It doesn't differentiate between cash machine, whether it's charging or it's free to use. It differentiated between, for example, when you go to retail and foods, whether the food store is selling organic foods, healthy foods, or a takeaway. If it's a takeaway, what sort of takeaway? So it has different categories for, say, popular services, but not for cash machine. If you want to look at the post office, it has like several categories which are aggregated. It's useful for certain categories, but not for others. In terms of the access roads, I used Esri's network mapping tool, which took account of those issues in terms of also whether the network that you're using is goes underpass or not, which I excluded. But that's a data created by someone somewhere, quality of which I haven't tested, to be honest with you. I checked it where I live, which looked pretty good. I can say that 95% of it's actually quite good, but I'm also mindful that that 5% is definitely not where it should be. But overall picture, I think it's quite robust. And one of the things that we want to show also not the importance of the individual household score, but inequality across the city, like city centre, what's happening in city centre, River Mersey, what's happening in Levenshulme, what's happening in like Wolseley and Salford, or in Stale and Salford. So I was more interested in the inequality within the city rather than individual household scores.
Yes, sir.
You again, I'm afraid. Regarding council consultations and things like that, You think the complexity of the Oxford plans, where you've got the ANPR cameras and the passes from one area to another, do you think that sort of contributed to some of the furore around the situation? Does LA consultation also do this? Why can't we just do Utrecht and make people eat their greens? Say, you know, this is good for you, so you're going to have to do it. But we can't just do what people ask us to do in consultation. And secondly to that, how do you create or inspire or sustain the political will when people start to get angry and you've got to try and, you know, keep the schemes going? I'm not expecting you to come up with a golden answer to that, but if you do, it'd be fantastic.
Well, yes, the town centre, the city centre filters certainly have contributed, let's say, to this debate. Since they are another level of controversy following on from the LTNs, there's no doubt that is part of the. I mean, the council has put in a lot of exemptions within these things, so it is not a black and white. And the council, I say, has been trying to listen as far as possible to what you could call justifiable grievances or justifiable reasons why I think there should be exemptions. Kind of steering what you could perhaps a middle path between achieving the objectives, which are basically traffic congestion is actually one of the, to reduce traffic congestion is one of the major benefits. And I forgot what your second part of your question is keeping political. I'm impressed by our cabinet member and the cabinet itself. I mean, they have kept to what their viewpoint is. We've set these out as policies. We want to achieve our policies. We've kind of looked at the pros and cons. We understand that there are that some people benefits from this, but they've weighed them up. And I think so in terms of keeping them on, I think it's because I'm an officer, so I don't make policy with me, but is to lay out as clearly as possible the benefits and the disbenefits, and point if it's perceived there are benefits at the end to kind of recommend that we follow their benefits. And I will say our politicians have been they're standing up to their principles at the moment, and it really it's quite impressive, because I mean on the long things like Utrecht and things like Ghent and all those places, it really they're significant because really basically there's been somebody who's got the political will and said we will do this, and in the end have the political will to do what is right is it's perhaps quite unusual. Well, that's a bit strong, isn't it? It isn't difficult. It's a very difficult thing for politicians, because they're elected and they have to listen to their electorate, and so yes, well, Oxfordshire politicians are really showing their mettle, I think, at the moment.
Eating greens is the answer.
Yeah,
definitely. Did you have something around that, Graham?
No, there's a few more we can draw from if we've got it.
No, I've got plenty. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Elvis, I have several questions. I don't know whether they are questions or remarks. One is to, I think the gentleman, I don't know the name. Like when you're doing your research, did you kind of ask people you are just mapping or using the map? Because when you talk about people owning cars or what they need, I think you need to reach to each and every household. So my question is that, did you reach to each and every household? And the other one is on the plan, the whole concept of the plan. I think the terminology is kind of confusing, but I would concur with her when she talked of this service, neighborhood, something, but 20 minutes, 15, it's kind of confusing because if you're providing services within maybe, for example, you have a residential area, are you going to provide big shopping mall within that very residential? So if it is so small in 15 minutes, you're not going to achieve what you want. I think it would be something like service neighborhood, or just leave it as a neighborhood concept, but not really to time. Then the other one is then there are other existing plans. What is like the relationship between the already existing own plans and maybe what you guys are coming up with? Maybe you would go relief from already existing plans. Then the last one is on the acceptability by people. I've seen somewhere the presentation, people are against the concept, but my understanding is that people take long to accept planning concept, and I'm an urban planner by profession, but whenever there is a new concept, people take long to accept it, and you need to use different means of communicating with these people, convincing them, and more especially telling them the end of it all. After implementing this concept, what are the benefits? But not just telling them maybe this is the concept, this is how it goes to work, but how do they benefit as people? Thank you.
Yes, as to the first question about the survey, almost 75 people, so we never didn't obviously ask questions to every household. There's like a million people live between Manchester and Salford, and only 75 people, and that's 75 we reached out via survey through Health Active Cities and our networks. It was very skewed towards people who are actually quite interested in active travel. I try to I live very close to I live in Russia, quite a diverse community, and I try to reach out to local networks, people who are perhaps not necessarily heard about 20-minute neighborhood before, and try to get their views on it, but it wasn't possible, unfortunately. If I had more money, if I had time, that would have been perfect, because that's ideally what we want to do, but it wasn't possible. In terms of answering the third question, what do you call it, ambiguity, neighborhood, I think you're right. If you look at garden cities 100 years ago, Ebenezer Howard talked about service accessibility, neighborhood scale planning. If you look at 1997, 1998, planning white paper, when Tony Blair came to power, they had like a diagram showing 10-minute walking distance to the services, 15-minute walking to school, 20-minute walking to hospitals, 25-minute walking to big shopping centers. So it doesn't need to be everything 20 minutes. I think with the 20-minute neighborhood, when it first came as an idea in 2016, and it was adopted by Mayor of Paris, the idea wasn't that everyone should walk everywhere in 50 minutes, but more like try to spark some provocation, spark innovation and rethinking how we live our cities. Rather than driving everywhere, we should be asking ourselves, can I actually walk there in 10 or 15 minutes? I think we are too focusing on what we call it and the metrics, exact metrics to be used to define it, rather than what is the actual vision behind this, which is to create walkable neighborhoods. I think Alex was saying that earlier, that maybe we should just call it livable neighborhoods. Seems much nicer, healthier neighborhoods. No one wants to live in an unhealthy neighborhood. Just I mean, people probably will say that, but I think we definitely right.
Just correct you. 20-minute neighborhood started in Portland, Oregon, 2008. I wrote about it in 2012. They've been around.
I think they used to call it complete neighborhoods, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. In 2016, whatever that French philosopher's name is, he coined the term 15-minute neighborhood, for which he gained an award. But yeah, Portland, Oregon, complete neighborhoods. We did a field trip and they were very helpful. They said we've been doing this, for a long time. But I think they're not calling it 50-minute neighborhood because they're calling it livable neighborhoods or something else.
Very short.
On then.
So, London have got a thing where it tells you the level of service of passenger transport. Manchester's got a very bad version of it that cheats a bit. I wondered what level of service you had to have at a bus stop for that to get a point. Or as part of the 50.
In our model, so we had 3 or 4 categories for public transportation: bus, tram, train, maybe just I don't remember. And that was part of the 20-minute, because we said if you're living in a 20-minute neighborhood, you should have access to a public transport point.
Yeah, but you can have a bus stop that has a 1 service a week.
Yeah, so
It has 1 service every 10 minutes or 5 minutes.
that's something that I looked into, unfortunately, because that will require quite a long time to getting the data, and I just didn't have the time. But yeah, that was something that we highlighted in our paper, said that's very important. I think the idea is that, again, these are the questions that people should be aware of. Currently, TCPA as an organization, Town and Country Planning Association, they are kind of spearheading that 20-minute neighborhood idea in England specifically. And in Scotland, 20-minute neighborhoods are part of the national planning framework. So there's lots of discussions around what can we do, what should be doing, and lots of toolkits are being emerging. And I think, as Flores was saying, the key thing is hyper local scale. Wherever you're trying to implement that, you should be talking to people, understanding what are the needs. Might be that the area is well serviced in terms of cycle and walking infrastructure, bus, or we live in an area where the public transportation is quite important. So that will be the main focus. Forget about tram or train.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. No, because we've got all questions there.
Well, it is, it's just about the published stuff. Is all your stuff online, or will we be paying for it? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's published in the Journal of Town and Country Planning Association, which is a kind of a non-profit charity, which is worth being member of. I think like 20 quid per year or something. And they have a journal, which every 2 months they publish, and our stuff published in 2 issues of the journal, March and April, and May and June issues.
Okay.
And it's all online, and TCPA is a wonderful organization. I think it's worth being a member.
I believe you.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're running over time now. We still have questions left. So thank you for everyone for joining us online. Thanks to our panel. Thank you everyone for coming.